A very warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Center for Aviation and Space Laws at the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences here in Kolkata. Today, we're gathered obviously for the workshop on peaceful uses of outer space. And as we can see, we have an exciting roster for you of persons who will be talking about the various issues with the peaceful uses of outer space. Now, quickly to move on with the conference, I will hand over the floor to Professor Shouvik sir, who is currently an assistant professor of law at NUJS and is also the associate director for the Center for Aviation and Space Laws. He's also a member of the Global Forum for Sustainable Market Actors or Responsible Trade and the network of Indian competition experts, the Cartel Working Group in particular. He's also associated with several leading national and international law journals in an editorial and reviewing capacity and has to date, to his credit, about 65 publications, including book chapters, content papers, and journal articles. Shouvik sir, over to you to introduce the workshop.
Thank you, Rohit. Very good afternoon to you all, and good morning to at least some of our participants. And so it's quite exciting to see this kind of initiative when it's even more, it's even better than when it comes from my own university. So this workshop on peaceful uses of outer space is one of the initiatives that has been started by the Center for Aviation and Space Laws. And over the past 1 year, the center has been formed to delve into the twin disciplines of both aviation and space laws and related policy measures. And we are also trying to pursue active collaborations with our other institutions, including education and research institutes, governmental and non-governmental organizations that regularly engage in specialized activities in these spheres, regulatory activities, and associated research. Of course, one of the primary objectives of the center is always to create a popular platform and forum for exchange of scholarship and intellectual creative output of researchers and academicians working on similar ideas. And to that end, we have organized this workshop. And the peaceful use of outer space, of course, the very topic is of considerable relevance in the modern world because the great rise and diversification of the use of outer space, it raises the question of what sort of limitations are there with regard to space activities. And of course, one of the more ultimate restrictions posed by space law is the use of outer space for peaceful purposes. This brings me back to the very start of the space age, so to speak, 1957, when Henry Cabot Lodge, the U.S. administration's representative to the UN, had made a very impassioned plea that the outer space environment be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Now, of course, while the Soviet Union and other nations rejected Lodge's overture, his speech stands as an astonishing vision of what outer space might have been. Now, so many years after Lodge's proposal, today the idea that some of the states would seek to voluntarily limit itself to exclusively peaceful use of outer space seems quite far-fetched. In fact, US itself has employed space-based force support technologies since even before the first Gulf War. And I think recently in 2019, the Space Force has been created, a new military branch specifically devoted to outer space military and support operations. And yet, questions and tensions concerning the use of space for peaceful purposes persist. And peaceful use of outer space is, we get to see it being cited frequently at the international level as a goal, if not an unwritten requirement of space activities. Is recently, again in 2019, I believe the UN General Assembly approved the draft resolution for international cooperation in the peaceful use of outer space. So this, of course, together with the UN Charter, which talks about prohibition of use of force, or which applies to outer space, along with the different other exceptions stipulated under general international law, and of course the Outer Space Treaty, which establishes a particular legal regime on celestial bodies, declaring them a demilitarized zone, banning the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in outer space, and so on and so forth. So like any other branch of public international law, space law is of an evolutive nature. So obviously, future adjustments and developments of its legal normativity in light of the abrupt growth and multiplication of the exploration and uses in the space arena remains open. So to that end, we have a fascinating group of experts to take you through this workshop today. We have with us Professor Bruce Gagnon, who is the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. We have Professor Dave Webb, who is the convener of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Dr. Aruna Kamilla, who is the associate professor at Galgosius University, and Professor Shubrata Ghoshrai from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, USA. And of course, our very own Professor Sandeepa Bhat, who is the professor of law at NUJS and also the director of Center for Aviation and Space Laws, and without who's active if initiatives, all of these programs would probably not take place. So without much ado, I now turn the podium over to Professor Bhat to deliver some opening remarks for this workshop. Over to you, Sandeep sir. Thank you.
Can you just confirm whether my PPT is visible?
It is, sir.
Not, yeah, it's starting, sir.
Starting. Okay. So, meanwhile, a very good morning to all who are watching from the United States, and also good afternoon for those who are actually being part of this event from India or maybe from Europe. This particular workshop, the idea has come primarily from, actually, I should say, the global network itself. As Shouvik has already mentioned, we have got actually very, very prominent personalities from the global network against weapons and nuclear power in the space. So they have got actually a Space for Peace Week. So this week has been declared as actually the Space for Peace Week. I think so. Those of you who don't know about it, you can go through their website. Bruce Gagnon has already actually shared, I think, the link for that in the chat box. You can go through it and you can get to know about their activities more. So this program has been actually organized primarily under this Space for Peace Week itself. When I basically approached Bruce, he not just happily accepted the invitation to have this kind of a program, but he also actually coordinated with his colleagues, and he could able to make this as a kind of a successful platform for a discourse on the peaceful uses of the outer space today. I should thank him as well as for his team for accepting this invitation and being part of our discourse in today's workshop. Now, before I open up the floor for them to debate over the issues of peaceful uses, I would like to just point out in maybe the initial 10 minutes in my opening remarks, how exactly Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is said to be the grundnorm in terms of the peaceful uses, is something grossly inadequate for the purpose of the peaceful uses of the outer space. To start with, as Shouvik has already mentioned, military activities in outer space has been a perennial concern. It's not something which is arisen maybe in the 21st century or maybe in the later part of the 20th century. This has been a concern since the beginning of the space activities, because both US and USSR, they basically invested in the space technology primarily for the purpose of getting a kind of a military advantage. Whatever may be the arguments regarding the scientific investigation or other things, the primary aim behind going for the space activities has been the militarization. And this was understood by the world community since the beginning itself. And that's why we can see that United Nations General Assembly has passed a series of resolutions on the peaceful uses of the outer space. Not just that, if you look into the treaty making also, we have the 5 treaties in 1960s and 1970s, and primarily the 2 important on the aspect of militarization are being the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement 1979. But Moon Agreement has got the limitation in terms of only few states ratifying that, only 18 states being part of it, and that too, it is confined to the moon and other celestial bodies. But whereas the outer space, matter of outer space, when it comes up, What is important is the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, which has a provision in terms of the peaceful uses and also de-weaponization to a certain extent. Of course, there are many other provisions also, which in an indirect fashion speak about the peaceful uses. But the direct provision under the Outer Space Treaty has been Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. For everyone's easy understanding, I have actually copied the text of the Outer Space Treaty, Article 4, in my slides. You can see there are two paragraphs. First paragraph you can see here. First paragraph reads like this. States parties to the treaty undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner. I should say that there are three major interpretational concerns in this paragraph. I'm just pointing out the interpretational concerns. I'm not telling that I accept this, because to my understanding, these are simply because of the faulty drafting of the treaty provision and nothing more than that. Three concerns. First, if we look carefully, it speaks only about nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. What about conventional weapons? There is no explicit mention about the prohibition on conventional weapons. Maybe a weapon like a sword or dagger or maybe a gun, if it is placed in the outer space, or any other weapon, whatever comes to our mind. Does it violate Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty? Going by the text, no. And which is a great concern, because estimates show that even a small piece of debris of 1 centimeter can completely paralyze a medium-sized satellite. The velocity with which actually it moves in the outer space, it is capable of paralyzing a medium-sized satellite of 5 to 6 tons. One can imagine how much of the havoc can be created in the outer space even by the conventional weapons. Forget about nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. So this has opened up a question whether we should redefine the weapon of mass destruction for outer space. So we understand the weapon of mass destruction in a distinct manner than what we understand on the Earth. So that's one of the debatable questions. Probably I will keep it for discussion in the course of time in the today's workshop. Then second, I should say this is a misinterpretation, but still the language has given a kind of a scope for it. Language used herein is nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't mention nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. One of the arguments which has been put forward is that when a nuclear weapon is only mass destructive in nature, that is prohibited in outer space. Adjustum generis interpretation. Right? So one of the norms which we know in the law. Right? So nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. Argument is that drafters would not have used any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. They should have simply said nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. That's the kind of an argument, but again, it is not an acceptable argument, because at the time when the Outer Space Treaty was drafted, understanding was that all nuclear weapons are mass destructive in nature. That's why they basically use the term nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. That was the basic understanding, but unfortunately, there is a misinterpretation which has been made by, especially from some of the scholars in the United States. Then, another major point which I have highlighted, if you look into the last portion, there is a prohibition on installing such weapons on celestial bodies. There cannot be installation of the weapons on celestial bodies. Interestingly, if you look into almost all other provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, they use the term moon and other celestial bodies. There is a reference to the moon separately in most other provisions. But whereas here it speaks about prohibition on installing the weapons on celestial bodies. Now, going by the Vienna Convention on Law of the Treaties, right, of course, moon is a celestial body, there is no doubt in terms of it. But since there is a two different expression used in different provisions, We have to go by the interpretation under the VCLT, Vienna Convention on Law of the Treaties, which simply says that you can't give the same meaning to two different expressions. So one of the arguments is that, again, there is no prohibition on installing the weapons on the moon. I completely agree that this is an absurd argument, right? It's an absurd argument, but still, whatever it may be, there is an argument which has been made due to the fact that the drafters did not consistently use the expression moon and other celestial bodies throughout the outer space treaty. That's the problem. And this is a problem which can be further illustrated in the next paragraph itself. This is the second paragraph of Article 4, right? Which starts with moon and other celestial bodies. First paragraph only mentioned about prohibition on installation in the celestial bodies. Now it again comes back with the moon and other celestial bodies. And let me just actually highlight 4 sentences of this paragraph separately. What are the problems in the interpretation? In this second paragraph, first sentence says that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used by all state parties to the treaty exclusively for peaceful purposes. First sentence of second paragraph. 2 problems in the interpretation. One, how do we interpret peaceful purposes? Initially, it has been interpreted as a non-military. Every country believed that it is non-military, no military activities in outer space. But unfortunately, as the military reconnaissance satellite becomes feasible, states have started to argue that the peaceful purposes is nothing but a non-aggressive purposes. If you want to use it for military, fine, but defensive, not aggressive. And even United States has gone to the extent of saying that self-defense would not be effective if you completely prohibit all military activities in outer space. That is why there is an argument that actually peaceful purposes need to be interpreted as a non-aggressive purposes and not non-military purposes. I should say that this is a marked departure from what was the understanding in the beginning when the Outer Space Treaty was entered into. That's the first thing. Second problem, again, I have highlighted the first portion, moon and other celestial bodies. It mentions moon and other celestial bodies to be used exclusively for the peaceful purposes. But where is the mention for outer space? It doesn't mention outer space has to be used exclusively for the peaceful purposes. Provision misses it out. Right? And what is explicitly not prohibited under the treaty provision, presumption is that they are permissible. That's what is the interpretation which has been made. So these are the 2 major problems in the interpretation of the first sentence. Second sentence, establishment of military bases, installations and fortifications, the testing of any type of weapons and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies shall be forbidden. There is a prohibition on installations, fortifications, the testing of weapons and all. But again, unfortunately, it mentions only about celestial bodies. Misses out both moon and outer space. So testing, especially ASAT testing, anti-satellite missile testing, they are going to be conducted more frequently by saying that there is no prohibition under Article 4. If you look into paragraph 1, which I discussed just before, it only speaks about actually orbiting or maybe stationing the weapon. That is prohibited in the paragraph 1 in outer space. But testing comes under the second paragraph. Unfortunately, it says only about prohibition in the celestial bodies. Doesn't mention about moon and the outer space. Again, a problem in terms of interpretation. The last 2 sentences mention that the use of military personnel for scientific research or for any other peaceful purposes shall not be prohibited. Then the use of any equipment or facility necessary for peaceful exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies shall also not be prohibited. Again, the problem is in terms of interpreting peaceful purposes and scientific research. Peaceful purposes, United States says non-aggressive, not non-military. So, if the scientific research, the so-called scientific research, is for a military advantage, can any country use the military personnel or military equipment for carrying on that scientific research? Right? So, that kind of a problem has arisen in the interpretation of the last 2 sentences of second paragraph of Article 4. So, Article 4 is completely riddled with the problem in terms of interpretation. And in order to rectify this, there have been multiple proposals which have been made over the period of time. Starting with the Venezuelan proposal for prohibiting all weapons in outer space, then USSR proposing for the so-called, International Space Inspectorate, World Space Organization. So different things have been proposed. Not just that, there have also been proposals with respect to a separate treaty on prevention of arms race in outer space. The PAROS, prevention of arms race in outer space, that has also been proposed over the period of time. But unfortunately, all those proposals are pending, and UN COPUS, United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of the Outer Space, which has been established primarily for the purpose of ensuring peaceful uses since 1961, it could not come up with any kind of a solution, concrete solution, with respect to preventing a military race in outer space. And I should say that currently we are in a much more dangerous scenario with respect to space militarization, because during the Cold War period, at least it was a race between only US and USSR. Now, what was bilateral during that time has become a kind of a multilateral issue, with most of the developing countries joining the race. We have also tested the ASAC, China tested anti-satellite missiles, right? So Japan, North Korea, so on and so forth. So there's a kind of a spillover in the race for the military advantage in outer space. So this is the time for us to actually awaken from our slumber and take appropriate measures to ensure that outer space is used exclusively for the peaceful purposes and benefit goes to everyone. Thank you so much, and I believe that actually today's discussion is going to help us in at least actually mapping what are the major issues, as well as actually getting some responses from the best of the best scholars who are available in today's discussion. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Sandeep sir. Moving on, we have Professor Bruce, who is one of the founding members of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, when it was created in 1992. He has also served as the coordinator of the organization since its creation. He actually began working in space issues in 1982 during the Ronald Reagan administration. And he is, and we thank him for his service, a Vietnam era veteran of the USA Air Force, and he began his career as a professional organizer with the United Farm Workers Union in Florida. At the moment, he will be presenting before everyone on the topic of space nuclear power, the uses, dangers, and past accidents. I hand over the floor to Professor Bruce to enlighten everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see this? Is
Yes.
it appearing?
Yes, it's visible, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Dr. Bhat and the others who have put together this workshop. We from the Global Network are very grateful to you. I think it can't be said often enough what an important moment we're living in as we try to prevent the militarization, the weaponization, and the nuclearization of space. So we need your voices. Thank you very much. Jane Narayana Rao from Nagpur passed away in June from COVID. He's the man standing behind the banner on the left, one of our board members in the Global Network, one of our greatest leaders. And he has really been most responsible for bringing the space issue to India in a big way. He's worked for many, many years to organize conferences in various communities, various cities around India. And also every year during our Keep Space for Peace Week, Rao and friends of his have organized events speaking in schools and other places across the country. So I would like at this moment to remember Mr. Rao, who was really a wonderful, wonderful friend and leader for us. The real question that we face today is what kind of space will we have in the future? The US has this slogan, Master of Space, on one of their Space Command buildings in Colorado, in the state of Colorado. This is not the kind of future we can accept. It's important to remember the origins of the US space program. During World War II, Adolf Hitler in Germany had a rocket team working inside of a mountain tunnel. That's the middle picture on the top, called Middlework, where they brought in thousands, tens of thousands of Jews, gypsies, communists, French resistance fighters, all different kinds of people as slaves to build the V1 and V2 rocket for the Nazis that they were firing against Paris and Brussels and London and other cities during the war. The scientist in charge of the operation is upper left, Werner von Braun, and next to him is Major General Walter Dornberger, who was Hitler's liaison to von Braun, making sure that he had everything he wanted, money, slaves, and everything else. Well, after the war, the United States had a program called Operation Paperclip, where they brought 1,500 of the top Nazi operatives and seeded them, put them into the US space program. And von Braun and his rocket team were brought to the US along with 100 copies of the V2 rocket to create the US space program. On the right, the picture of von Braun, some of his former Nazi scientists, along with a US military officer, and they again created the US space program. In 1997, the US Space Command published this document called Vision for 2020, where they said that the United States would control space, dominate space, and deny other countries access to space, that the United States would be the master of space. And they said by 2020, they would have space forces that would be in place to make sure they could deliver this vision. Well, it's interesting that in 2020, President Donald Trump created a new branch of the military, like the Marines or the Air Force or the Army or the Navy, a new branch called the Space Forces. Another planning document, this was commissioned, a study commissioned by the Congress of the United States back in late 80s. I think it was 89 or 88 or 89 that this book was published. And one of the key elements of this book was calling for nuclear power in space to provide power for weapons in space and for uses on planetary bodies. In 1963, the United States created its first space nuclear reactor that they envisioned would power weapons in space. It was called NERVA. And then over the years, a series of nuclear devices have been prepared. This was the Cassini mission that was launched in 1997, carrying 72 pounds of plutonium-238 on board. But prior to this mission, in 1989 and 1990, NASA launched other plutonium-powered space generators on missions to go into deep space. At that time, I was working for an organization called the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, and we organized an international campaign against all of those NASA plutonium launches. Galileo, Ulysses in 89 and 90, and then in 1997, we launched a campaign called against Cassini. This was from a news conference that we held in Washington, D.C. that was aired on national television, a channel called C-SPAN that covers government affairs. And people all over the world were working to help us stop Cassini. It was, in fact, after the Cassini was actually launched that we learned that the White House received more communications opposing Cassini than on any other issue in the history of the United States. Postcards came from throughout the UK and other parts of Europe. One of my favorite stories was in Australia, on the island of Tasmania, part of Australia. 1,000 faxes were received at the White House from the residents of Tasmania, Australia, and it was all over the world. People were contacting the White House saying, "Don't risk our lives by launching Cassini." We learned that it's not just that there might be an accident upon launch that would be catastrophic, a release of plutonium carried by the winds, but we learned that, in fact, the fabrication process at Department of Energy laboratories, where they create the generators, the devices for these missions that are also dangerous. This particular article said that there were 244 cases of worker contamination as they were fabricating the plutonium devices for this particular mission. The Department of Energy has a long, dirty track record where water and air in local communities surrounding their laboratories are contaminated by these nuclear space devices. This book, Mining the Sky, talks about how huge amounts of money can be made from mining the asteroids, comets, and planets in the future. This book was written by a NASA scientist some years ago. And today, this shirt on the right, this is a shirt sold by SpaceX, the company that is owned by Elon Musk, who proposes to occupy Mars and to explode 10,000 nuclear weapons over the atmosphere of Mars in order to terraform Mars to make it green like the planet Earth. An insane idea, but these are the dangers that we currently face today. NASA is at this moment, excuse me, at this very moment, NASA is planning to test nuclear rockets over our heads in lower Earth orbit in the coming years as they prepare to develop a nuclear rocket to get to Mars, to cut in half the amount of time it takes to get to Mars. Just imagine an accident over our heads in lower Earth orbit with these nuclear reactors falling back to Earth and burning up on reentry. There are plans to have nuclear-powered mining colonies on the Moon and Mars. The nuclear industry views space as an exciting new market for their deadly toxic product. This is an example of some of the nuclear reactors they're planning on Mars. And the rovers driving around Mars today are powered with nuclear devices. These rovers are taking soil samples as they are looking for places where they might find resources like magnesium and cobalt and uranium on these various planetary bodies. Just this morning, I found this article. One of the Department of Energy national laboratories in the state of Idaho has been selected to help build this nuclear reactor for these Mars rocket engines. So this project is moving quickly ahead with very little public awareness and virtually no public debate about the dangers involved and the cost to the Earth if there was an accident. It's not just a theoretical equation that there might be a space nuclear accident. In fact, there have been many over the years by the United States and the former Soviet Union or Russia. At the very top of the list is 1964, when a US military satellite with 2 pounds of plutonium-238 fell back to Earth, vaporizing in the atmosphere, spreading the deadly toxin worldwide. And one of the chief scientists for the space industry studied that particular accident and believes it's one of the reasons for the increase in cancers around the Earth since 1964. So when you have a series of accidents that release or potentially release plutonium or uranium into the atmosphere, we're really asking for trouble. We're asking for big, big trouble here on the planet. In spite of the treaties that Dr. Bhat outlined, the Outer Space Treaty and also the Moon Treaty, that said that the planetary bodies are the province of all humankind, the United Nations very astutely trying to preempt any wars in space over control of the planetary bodies, created these treaties, the Moon Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty. But in 2015, President Obama signed a law giving American corporations and American wealthy people the right, as he saw it, to go out and make land claims on the planetary bodies to begin mining operations. And so today we see very wealthy individuals moving out to try to take control of the planetary bodies, as again in the case of Elon Musk claiming that he wants to occupy Mars. Jeff Bezos, pictured on the right, he owns Amazon, he owns the Washington Post. He wants to set up bases on the moon for resource extraction in the coming years. What gives him the right? Who gives him the right to claim that he can do so? And who gives the United States or China or any other country the right to claim that they can have bases on the moon or any other planetary body? And right now we're seeing Elon Musk launching what could be more than 50,000, some people say even 80,000 satellites for 5G. They say they want to have a 5G satellite over everyone's head on the planet, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But few people are talking about the military applications, the military use of 5G that would allow greater surveillance of the people on the planet and greater targeting of the people on the planet. Again, one more danger that we face from the militarization of space. Astronomers are deeply worried about all of these satellites orbiting the Earth, basically ruining the dark sky at night, making it virtually impossible for the astronomers to be able to study the dark sky as they've done for so many years. And another danger of all these launches that these corporations are now creating because of the pollution coming from rocket exhaust, where these rockets are now punching a hole in the Earth's ozone layer, exacerbating, making worse the climate crisis that we face today. So there's a direct link between rocket launches, space exploration, and climate crisis, something we need to be more aware of and more careful about. There needs to be more regulation about the launching of rockets into space. We can't just allow anybody that wants to launch millions and, tens of thousands of rocket satellites into space. And because of all these launches, there's a need for more launch sites, more spaceports all over the world. And this is happening all the time. On the left in this picture is Rocket Lab in New Zealand. The people were promised that this spaceport in New Zealand would only be for civilian launches. But Lockheed Martin Corporation has taken over ownership of this spaceport and is only launching military satellites, military launches from this place. On the right, in the state of Alaska, is Kodiak Island, another launch facility that the residents of Kodiak Island, a pristine nature preserve, in the middle of it has been placed this rocket spaceport. They were told that it would only be for civilian purposes, but every launch from this place so far has been a military launch. And even Israel has tested military rockets from Kodiak Island, Alaska. It's now been announced that India will launch from Kodiak Island, which is famous for its bears and its salmon. So inside of this pristine nature preserve sits this rocket launch facility that even India plans to use in the coming years. The people that live in this area are very angry and upset about this spaceport in their community. You might know about this test of an anti-satellite weapon by India in 2019. And it's just an example of the dangers that we now face as the United States and Russia and China, India now have tested these anti-satellite weapons. We know that when you blow up a satellite in space, it creates more space debris or space junk, which is increasingly becoming a problem. There is so much space debris orbiting the Earth today that scientists fear that at some point in time there's going to be a cascading collision of this space debris with existing satellites and even the International Space Station. And they fear that when this happens, there will be so much of this debris that life on Earth will go dark. Think of it. Today, much of what we do on Earth is using space technology. This workshop is using space technology. It's using satellite technology, your cell phones, cable TV, weather prediction, internet banking, air traffic control. So many things we do today are using space satellites. If we continue to allow this destruction of objects in space, soon the planet will go dark. And scientists say we will be entombed to the planet. We will not be able to get a rocket through this minefield orbiting the Earth. So we must begin to view space in a new way. Space is an environment that needs to be protected, and we're not doing a very good job of it at this time. So please help us think of space in a sacred way. We've long been connected to the night sky on this planet. For tens of thousands of years, people have wondered about what the heavens were all about. Who is God? Where does God come from? Where does life come from? This is a sacred place that space is. and we must help the people of the planet think in a new way about how we view space and how we utilize space. Thank you so much for being a part of this workshop, and we hope that you will help us free the sky from nuclear weapons, from space weapons. Let's keep space for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. That was extremely enlightening. I would also like to mention that anyone who has any questions specifically for a resource person, please put them down in the chat box and we shall discuss them right after the presentations. Sort of picking up where Professor Bruce left off, I believe Professor Dave Webb will now talk about emerging technologies and the environment, and specifically how they affect the environment that Sir Bruce had obviously laid out in his presentation. Professor Dave in particular is the convener of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He is a retired university engineering professor who switched to peace and conflict studies. And currently, he is also the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, the vice president of the International Peace Bureau, and a patron of the UK Group for Scientists for Global Responsibility. I shall yield the floor to Professor Dave to enlighten us about the emerging technologies and the manner in which they affect the space environment and the environment on Earth as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join this important conference. I hope you can see the slide here. This is
yes,
the okay, good. So thank you. Yes, and I'm going to repeat some of what Bruce has already said, actually, but I think it's worth repeating because it's extremely important. So we've already heard about the Outer Space Treaty, and the Outer Space Treaty was proposed to preserve the space environment as pristine as possible. But with the rapid growth of the space industry, problems are arising for the environment on Earth, and these problems are going to escalate in the near future. The space budgets of the main spacefaring nations gives a clue as to where the push for space is coming from. The US, you can see here, the US, China, Russia, France, and India are the major spacefarers of the world, and a sizable slice of those budgets involves supporting the further militarization of space. The number of space forces around the world is also growing, and so are their budgets as well. And in 2020, the total global annual expenditure for military space was over $28 billion. That's a considerable amount of money, but the use of satellites has expanded rapidly in all sorts of areas of our everyday lives, as Bruce has already said, and space is now an integral part of communications, broadcasting, and many other applications. Space is big business, with some forecasters suggesting it could be worth over $1 trillion by 2040. Morgan Stanley estimates that the global space industry could generate considerable revenues in the near future, and you can see here where the money is being spent. The major category, you can see these are the years along here, and this is the amount of money going up on the vertical axis. The light green category is referred to as second order impacts, and that represents the growth expected in a world where everyone is connected to the internet. So the most significant short and medium term financial opportunities may come from satellite broadband internet access. And in addition, many of the commercial launches also have military applications, of course, and these kind of so-called dual use programs are sometimes difficult to differentiate the military from the commercial parts. In addition, the number of space launches is also increasing. And as we can see here in this graph, the green part of the graph is the majority of launches which are coming from private industry at the moment. In the past, it's been military. Now the private industry is taking over with the number of launches. There's growing competition in this area, and space companies are now interested in building networks of mini satellites launched into low Earth orbit, or LEO, to provide global internet services. Older satellite systems rely on bigger satellites that orbit higher up in geostationary orbits. But companies such as SpaceX and OneWeb are planning to provide much faster communications from lower orbits. Low Earth orbits, satellites at a height of, low Earth orbit satellites orbit at a height of 200 to 2,000 kilometers from the ground, with an orbital period which ranges from 90 minutes to 2 hours. Their low altitudes mean that they have high velocities, and they can make some 12 to 16 turns of the Earth every day. This also means, however, that they're only visible to a particular observer on the ground for a short time. One specific orbit, a polar orbit, is inclined at 90 degrees to the equatorial plane and covers both poles. This orbit is fixed in space, and the Earth rotates underneath, and so one satellite can in principle provide coverage to the entire globe, although there are long periods during which the satellite is out of view of any one specific ground station. This kind of orbit is often used for monitoring and surveillance purposes by either commercial or scientific exploits or military as well. The satellites store the information that they collect, and then they download it when they approach a receiving station. For commercial purposes, though, large numbers of network satellites are required to give a continuous global coverage. The military also often use commercial companies for launching satellites, and this increase in the use of LEO is also leading to an increase in launch facilities and launch providers, and the launching satellites of satellites into LEO is becoming very competitive, resulting in lower costs. As we can see from this graph here, the costs are for this is a graph that shows the cost of per kilogram of cargo from particular principal launch vehicles. And as you can see, the SpaceX Falcon 9 is particularly competitive. It's one of the cheapest ways of launching things into space, satellites or whatever. However, as the number of launches increases, the effect on the environment also increases. And one concern is the effect of rocket exhausts. Exhausts depend on the type of exhaust depends on the fuel being used, and many rockets use a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen, while others use liquid hydrogen or some other more complex compounds. In 2005, there were reports that levels of perchlorate in breast milk and vegetables were high in many areas near launch sites. Perchlorates occur naturally, but indications were that rockets were contaminating water supplies, and perchlorate has been linked to thyroid ailments and is considered particularly dangerous to children. Rocket engine exhausts also contain gases and particles that can affect Earth's climate and the stratospheric ozone layer that protects us from the ultraviolet rays from the sun, as Bruce has already mentioned. In the past, rocket launches have been assumed to be not too much of a threat to the global environment because the space industry was small and unchanging. However, now, today's rapid growth and the lack of research and oversight is causing some concerns among scientists and citizen groups. Let's consider some of the different types of rocket propellants. Shuttle launches of the past and the Apollo-era Saturn V vehicles use liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, which produce water vapor, which is the biggest contributor to the natural greenhouse effect. And although it may have little effect at ground level, at high altitudes, the effects are very large. Water vapor emissions can impact the mesosphere and the ionosphere. And you can see here, this is just a diagram showing the different sections of the Earth's atmosphere as you go from the Earth's surface. So here, the line called the Kármán line there is the line that differentiates what we would call near Earth space from outer space. So at 100 kilometers is where astronautics rather than aeronautics is an important feature. And the areas of the atmosphere that we're talking about are the thermosphere, the mesosphere, the stratosphere in particular. The stratosphere contains the ozone layer that we've been talking about. So, so water vapor emissions can impact the mesosphere and ionosphere, and high altitude cloud blooms attributed to specific launches have been frequently observed. Transient dropouts in electron content have also been observed in expanding ionospheric plumes, mainly from their impact on space-based navigation signals. In addition, the very high carbon emissions associated with liquid hydrogen come from the very energy-intensive processes needed to create and store the fuel at extremely low temperatures before it's used. And it's been estimated that for each ton of liquid hydrogen used, about 25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is emitted. This compares with about 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for aviation fuel. It's also estimated that the launch of Blue Horizon's New Shepard spacecraft is responsible for something like 330 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent being released. Currently, the global quantities of these gas emissions from rockets are much less than atmospheric inputs from other sources. But the question is, for how long? Other rockets that use kerosene, as in SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Russia's Soyuz rockets, produce alumina and black soot or black carbon particles in the stratosphere. Rocket engines emit large amounts of black carbon compared to a modern jet engine. During flight through the stratosphere, black carbon can account for several percent of the rocket emissions, but it's only about 1% of the emissions from modern jet engines. In 2018, rockets emitted more than 225 tons of black carbon particles into the stratosphere, comparable to the annual amount of black carbon emitted by global aviation. Meanwhile, solid fuel rockets have emitted over 1,400 tons of alumina particles into the stratosphere. Black carbon has been found to play an important role in global warming. Rocket launch particles are ending up in the stratosphere, a region important for weather, and because they're so small, they stay there for some 3 to 4 years and slowly build up. Black carbon and alumina particles reduce the intensity of the solar flux on the top of the atmosphere and so contribute to the cooling of the Earth's lower atmosphere and surface. However, it's been shown that the Earth responds to rocket particle injections in very complex ways. Unraveling this complexity and accurately assessing the potential effects of the coming surge in rocket emissions will require sophisticated computer modeling, which has yet to be performed. As we've seen, the annual number of rocket launches is due to grow fast, and smaller satellites are becoming cheaper to launch. Also, commercial entities like SpaceX and Blue Origin are eyeing space tourism, the moon, and possibly Mars. And all this means that there will be a continuing increase in launches and in launch sites. And in particular, the recent ventures into space tourism by billionaire entrepreneurs does not bode well, especially if this activity is extended to become more affordable and more available. Obviously, the best time to deal with the problem is when it's still small and manageable. And this is especially true in space, where problems can linger for a very long time. For example, as again, Bruce has already mentioned, the problem of orbital debris has been observed, but not really considered seriously until quite recently. The buildup of debris in space has been growing since the dawn of the space age. It's grown so much that in 1978, NASA scientist Donald J. CASL proposed a situation where two colliding objects in space could generate more debris that then collides with other objects, creating even more. This has become known as the Kessler syndrome, and such a self-sustaining cascade of collisions of space debris in low Earth orbit could eventually result in a cloud of debris traveling at 36,000 kilometers per hour, so dense that rockets may not be able to penetrate it. Again, as Bruce has already mentioned. The European Space Agency estimates that there are roughly 166 million man-made objects in space, ranging in size from 1 millimeter to the size of a refrigerator. And although there are around 2,000 active satellites in orbit, there are also 3,000 inactive ones. As launch numbers rise and as tens of thousands of satellites with a limited lifetime are placed in low Earth orbit, the problem will increase significantly. And a more recent problem presented by placing so many satellites in orbit is the threat to the night sky, which is due to be scarred by the trails of satellites as they pass overhead. As Bruce mentioned, astronomers investigating very distant objects need to take very long exposure photographs of the sky, and these are already being photobombed by satellites in low Earth orbit. And finally, there are two other threats to the environment from launch accidents and the construction of new space ports. Accidents at launch cause a considerable amount of environmental destruction and contamination. The increase in satellite launches is accompanied by an increase in places to launch from, and the response of Elon Musk is to shrug his shoulders and to keep trying until it works. However, an accident at the launch site on Kodiak Island in Alaska that Bruce mentioned in 2014 resulted in such heavy damage that the site was not reopened for 2 years. And the new push for the use of nuclear power in space creates the possibility of a launch accident spreading deadly nuclear materials over an extremely large area. There's also an increase in the number of new spaceports being established around the world as more and more governments and businesses see opportunities in cashing in on the new space gold rush. The construction of these spaceports is often opposed by local residents who are concerned about the effects on their environment and the destruction of local ecologies. But their arguments are usually drowned out by the promises of jobs and prosperity from the income that might arise through the spaceports themselves. So how do we deal with these growing problems? Obviously, much more research is needed into the environmental effects of rocket launches. And there needs to be some international agreement on limiting the number of launches. Joyriding and space tourism does not really seem to be a very good reason to pollute the space and Earth environment. At one of the Global Network conferences on space use and ethics, which was held in Darmstadt, Germany in 1999, the mathematician and physicist Jürgen Schäffren, now a professor at the University of Hamburg, spoke on the peaceful and sustainable use of space and developed a set of criteria for assessing the use of space technology to ensure its societal acceptance and its costs and its resources, goals and benefits. These are the criteria he suggested, 8 of them, for the assessment of future space projects, which can also be applied to other fields of technology. I think these are really worth considering and thinking about in much more detail than we perhaps have today, but I'll leave them here these very sensible suggestions on the screen for you to consider, and we could maybe discuss these later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that information, sir. Now we shall invite Dr. Aruna Kamila, who is an associate professor with a demonstrated history of working with the legal services industry. She is, in fact, has a lot of experience in space law, including other fields such as cyber law, public international law, maritime law, etc., and is currently an associate professor at the School of Law in Galgotia's University, Greater Noida, Uttar Pradesh, India. She is also the chair of the LLM program at the university and is the head for the postgraduate legal studies. And in fact, she is in charge of the Center for International Law and for Research in International Law and the Law Journal in the university. In fact, I would also like to mention that she has about 20 years of academic and industrial experience, both in India and abroad. And before us, everyone today, she shall be speaking on the topic demilitarization of outer space and the plausibility for the same. I yield the floor to ma'am for enlightening information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohit, for a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Sandeepa sir, for giving me this opportunity. And I'm really glad to be a member of Global Network, without which I wouldn't be here. So thanks to all of you and also to the participants here listening to this workshop today. Coming to my topic, that is demilitarization of outer space and the plausibility. So we all know that the space which we knew as the province of all mankind, the use of which shall be for peaceful purposes and carried out for the benefit and interest of all countries, has been diluted of late to a large extent. And in fact, we could witness this from the attitude of the states that traveled from the agreement to peaceful use of space to a dedicated space command. So the space has been used for deployment of satellites, of course, which are very much aiding us in the communication, broadcasting, navigation, disaster management, meteorological forecast, and also these benefits which have been reaped by almost every country on this planet. And these satellites have also aided in the remote sensing, surveillance, aerial photography, scientific experimentation. And this particular satellites, they have a dual use and nature, as these activities are also exploited for military purposes. So this militarization and weaponization of the space, so apart from being ancillary to technological developments, can be actually attributed to the politico-military events that have unfolded in the past 3 or even 4 decades, we can say, wherein the world has witnessed a paradigm shift in the matters of security. So the factors such as loss of power by USSR, the rise of fundamentalism, terrorism, these have actually raised menacing threats to global peace and security. And the nations felt that there is an urgent need to equip and arm their security forces for ever-changing warfares as well, which are like various warfares that are taking place because of this technological advancement. And one is this, and also we can include the cyber warfare and many other warfares we can even discuss about. So in the light of the growth in the economic power, the nations felt that it is very much important for them to project their respective powers, that is technical, be it technical, economic, or even military, to consolidate the balance of the power in the new world order. So the projection and manifestation of the military might in the light of the technological advancement, not restricted to land and sea, and the superpowers especially are consistently trying to dominate the outer space by even weaponizing and militarizing the outer space. In fact, this militarizing of space has happened or taken place long ago, which I would be addressing that aspect as well. So this use of outer space to fight wars is not a new concept. Rockets reaching high into the atmosphere has been in discussion since Second World War. The investments made by the Nazis towards development of such rockets are well known to everyone. And even in the 1960s, earlier USSR had an orbital weapon called a killer satellite that was developed to approach the space target using the guidance of radar and then explode shrapnel warheads to kill it. So, however, this project failed due to problems in the guidance system. And the USSR also secretly tested during the late 1960s an orbital weapon known as fractional orbit bombardment system, which was to, in short, it was called as a FOBS as well, and which was to be used to place hydrogen bomb in low Earth orbit for quickly launching an attack against the ground target. So, however, these FOBs were prohibited by virtue of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, that is in SALT II Agreement of 1979, which prohibited the deployment of FOBS systems. And during the period of Cold War, there were several reports of US spy satellites being blinded by the anti-satellite lasers developed by the USSR. And the USSR also used MiG-31 as an anti-satellite launch platform. And the US in 1985 successfully actually targeted a satellite orbiting at 555 kilometers by carrying AGM-69 on a modified F-15 Eagle plane. And US during 1980s, this has actually extensively engaged in the weaponization of the space through its strategic defense initiative, also known as Star Wars. And I think many times Bruce was addressing this particular aspect in our earlier talks many times. So this Star Wars program initiated by then President Ronald Reagan. The idea behind the program was to put satellites into the space that were capable of detecting the enemy missiles that were launched and then shoot them down. So these space-based anti-missiles were developed not as a substitute of the ground defense, but as a part of multi-defense strategy that would strengthen the ground defense. And the ground defenses also included the sea-based interceptors that were carried by the ships, as well as ground-based terminal high altitude defense area, and which were designed with the objective of engaging short and medium range missiles. And in particular, this use of space technologies was extensively seen during the Gulf War in 1991 and also NATO intervention in Kosovo. So this advancement in space technologies, as well as its use, such as space-based surveillance, communication, navigation, gave US an asymmetric benefit in the Gulf War. So the US, owing to its highly capable electro-optical and radar imaging satellite, was able to pinpoint the location of the enemy and therefore knew where and when to attack. So due to the extensive use of the space-based technologies in the Gulf War, the war is also known as the First Space War. And this technological advancement by the developed states such as the US and then USSR created geopolitical chain reaction. So the rivalry between US and China is superpower is well known in the international political corridors. And China often retaliates proportionally to compete in the rivalry. And the Sino-US competition further reached new heights when China successfully conducted an anti-satellite test in 2007 and destroyed its defunct satellite by using a kinetic warhead of SE-19. So this anti-satellite, after 3 failed attempts, and this has happened. And the US actually responded next year by firing a standard ABM as an anti-satellite to destroy one of its aging satellites. Russia has once again started. And this development of prototype laser weapon named as so-called Exilion in 2013, China announced that it is going to launch a suborbital rocket carrying a scientific payload to study the upper ionosphere. But this has been considered as a ploy to test a new ground-based anti-satellite system by the US. So Israel has also made operational its anti-ballistic missile having capability of exo-atmospheric interception. And even in 2019, China launched again a satellite using a Long March 11 rocket that lifted off from a floating launch pad in the LOC. So the advancements that were made by the China in the space technology cannot be solely held liable for creating ripples in the international political corridors. Because the US have always taken divergent stand when it comes to matters concerning space security. And this is quite evident from the stand of US under the leader of George W. Bush when the US wanted to enhance its power by placing offensive as well as defensive weapons into the outer space. And even Donald Rumsfeld's Space Commission in 2001 recommended that ensure that the president will have the power to deploy weapons in the space. So after these recommendations, President Bush withdrew from the 30-year-old anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia that had actually banned the placement of weapons in the space. And it is also very important to note that the US supports the discussion on the space and disarmament issue, but it is not willing to enter into any negotiations that pertains to space weaponry. And on the other hand, China had continuously proposed establishing of an international structure for prevention of space from weaponization over the past few years. And even very recently also, they have raised this issue in Newman. But America, US never heeds to this, never. Because China also simultaneously worked towards the development of space weapons. And China has actually ambitious plans when it comes to space exploration and also weaponization. Because on an average, China is undertaking 20 space program missions every year. The anti-satellite programs of China include signal jammers, experimental lasers, and land-based missiles, soft landing of a rover on the dark side of the moon. And this has already been achieved by China. And now it intends to have a habitable space station known as Tiangong-2 by 2022 and put astronauts on the moon. And further ambition includes Mars lander mission. And in 2015, China launched DAMP, which is considered to be the most capable dark matter explorer. And even in 2016, China launched QESS, which is the world's first quantum communication satellite. Currently, China is engaged in the development of Long March 9 or Changzheng 9, which is a super heavy carrier rocket capable of carrying maximum payload capacity of 140,000 kilograms to that low Earth orbit, and even 50,000 kilograms to lunar transfer orbit, or 44,000 kilograms to the Mars. So this history shows that use of the space assets for advancing military agenda is not a novel concept. And the only novelty that one can see in the use of the space technology to jam as well as destroy the operational space assets of the other states. In fact, this has happened very recently by US. The US Space Force has received its first offensive weapons. And in fact, Carl Grossman, he has shared one of his articles with me in which it states very clearly that the first offensive weapons in the form of a satellite jammer known as a counter communication systems, block 10.2, were delivered to the fort in March. So the weapon does not destroy any enemy satellites, but can be used to interrupt enemy satellite communications and hinder enemy early warning systems meant to detect a US attack. In fact, this particular aspect can be even equated to many cyber warfare aspects as well. Here we can actually see how this warfare is changing its shape. And with the tune, how US is actually investing, making its investments in the private sector, it can be even considered as its a capitalistic attitude, we can say. But here we can very clearly understand that the Kiwi American firm secured nearly 24.35 million US dollars from the US Air Force new Space Force division to develop the upper stage of its neutron rocket. And then the crew capable neutron, which will be able to lift an 8-ton payload into orbit, is due to launch in 2024. And then 24.35 million US dollars funding revealed overnight is part of a wider like 87.5 million US dollars around to support new technology development programs by private space launch operators. So Space Force also awarded 24.35 million US dollars to Jeff Bezos, who owned Blue Origin, toward the development of its planned New Glenn heavy lifting rocket. And the same amount went to Boeing, Lockheed Martin, joint venture, United Launch Alliance, towards its pending Vulcan Centaur heavy lifting rocket. And even Elon Musk owned SpaceX received 14.47 million US dollars toward the development of its planned super heavy lifting Starship rocket. So, in fact, most of the times these nations, all these spacefaring nations are who are into these endeavors or ventures into this, they blame the other nations, saying that they are left with no other option except continue with their actions, like as a defensive mode, which is actually accepted by laws of war and United Nations Charter. So, in a statement to C4ISRNet, a Space Force spokesperson said that General Raymond has stated many times that China and Russia have directed energy capabilities that are designed to damage or even destroy our satellites. So his response to this Congressman James Langevin's question was confirming that our architecture, these architecture developments in the face of these threats are appropriate. So now the question that arises for consideration is, where does the quest for power in the new world order stops for the states in the absence of international regime for regulation of the conduct of the states in the outer space? As well mentioned by Sandeepa sir earlier, that Article 4 is missing in many aspects addressing these issues, especially. So the militarization of space has not only created a sense of mistrust and suspicion in the states, but also severely prejudiced the civilian infrastructure that is based and dependent on the satellites for navigation. As Bruce mentioned, one day it can become, the world would become dark, it would end up in dark. Because once after anyone takes a one step ahead towards these actions, that's it. So all these satellites which are used for navigation and all those things which we have I just mentioned a while ago. So in the light of the consequences of the weaponization and militarization, it becomes important that the states such as US, China, and Israel, which have either been abstaining from or vetoing the UN-sponsored efforts, assume collective responsibility to comply with the existing framework such as Outer Space Treaty, or endorse such treaties and convention which ensure that weaponization of the space does not take place. In fact, these nations, these powerful nations, are creating a sense of insecurity in other spacefaring nations. And these other nations, they are ending up investing in the same endeavors or creating these unnecessary endeavors, or creating these warheads or the anti-satellite missile, just like India has tried this mission of Shakti in 2019. And these things should not be happening if we really want to have a sustainable space in future. So it is up to the powerful nations to curtail their actions. At least now they realize the damage that's going to happen and work towards peace, or involve themselves in such endeavors where the peace prevails. I always say that we can explore but not exploit. So we can explore. See, without exploring, today we may not have had these technological developments in place. So we are able to reap the fruits of this. So, in order to reap more fruits, they should be following something in a very peaceful manner and allowing other states also have equal share in the profits. So it would be really appreciable if the spacefaring nations realize the importance of keeping the space for peace and demilitarize the outer space in a hope of the same. And with this, I take leave now. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aruna Kamala. Thank you for taking out the time to be here with us. Now I shall move on and introduce Professor Shubhroto Ghosh, who is a research affiliate with the Program in Science, Technology and Society at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the USA. He is also a visiting professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and he has spent almost 2 decades as an engineer in defense research before transitioning into policy after receiving the IEEE Congressional Fellowship. In fact, after doing so, he became a professional staff member of the US or United States Congress and became a senior defense analyst at the United States Government Accountability Office, which is the investigative arm of the Congress. His research interests include military funding of research, nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament, space weapons, etc. And lastly, he is also a co-chair of the International Network for Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility. Before yielding the floor to Professor Shubhroto, I would request everyone, all participants, to kindly turn on their videos so that we can take a screenshot while Professor Shubhroto is speaking and display it at our website or wherever we would like to publish. Thank you so much. Over to you, Professor Shubhroto.
Okay, I will try to screen share. I haven't done this before. Let's see. Can you see my slide?
Not at the moment, sir.
Okay. I pressed the upward arrow next to the hand sign.
Yes, sir.
That's the one, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Before that, you will have to open the PPT first.
Yes, I have that open on my screen. Let's see, 1 second. Let's see. Okay. Is it coming up?
Not at the moment, sir. No.
Okay. All right.
You have to click on the on your PowerPoint after you've done all those other things.
Oh, okay. See here one more time. Okay. Oh, okay. Well,
have you actually chosen between whether to share the entire screen or only the window? I think there should be a prompt when you click on the present screen thing.
I think I've chosen the full screen. Let's see then.
Okay.
Should I then select window as okay?
Yeah, it would be better if you select the window and then click on the PPT, and you should be having the share option once you click on the PPT.
Okay. It's okay. And I have very poor eyesight. So anyway, I do not have fancy pictures to show. So I think I can just speak from my slides, and I can make the slides available later on. So the title of my talk is U.S. Missile Defense and Space Policy Harmful to Strategic Stability. And you have one of the advantages and disadvantages at the same time of speaking as being the last speaker is that everything one wants to say has already been said. So it is both an advantage and a disadvantage. But anyway, I will focus on a relatively narrow part of the discussion about international space security in particular and global security in a broader scale, and put the policy of the US government in perspective in all this, especially in the two very critical areas that affect space, which is missile defense and weaponization of space. Here, I'll be strictly discussing military space policy. So let me set the stage. As the dominant superpower, US behaves with little regard to the accepted rules and norms of international affairs. In this regard, space is no exception. And then I will discuss US approach to the current space law. I'm not a space law expert at all. I did work on some aspects when I was in Congress on the staff of the House International Relations Committee and the House Armed Services Committees, but those are many years ago, and that's not my expertise. But I will refer to this in passing. And then I will critique US policy on missile defense and space weapons. And finally, I will talk about our forthcoming report of the International Network of Engineers and Scientists, of which I am a co-chair along with Professor Jürgen Schäffern, whose name Dave mentioned regarding his talk at Darmstadt some time ago. Dave and I were members of this international group, and Dave did write two very important articles along with Professor Schäffern. So my first slide would have said in the title is that US is a law unto itself. It helps create norms and rules and then breaks them at will when they no longer serves its interests. And examples are many. So I will give a few examples. Let's say about the UN Charter that was mentioned by Rohit, I think, in his first introductory remarks. That UN Charter mentions, among others, security in the space, preserving space. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of President Franklin Roosevelt, the famous US president during the war. And Eleanor Roosevelt, after the war, during the establishment of the United Nations, was the prime mover in setting up and the drafting of the UN Charter. And now we find US violating the UN Charter in so many ways. Also, it doesn't recognize sovereignty of nations, as in Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan, as we have seen, or in the case of Kosovo and Siberia. I mean, sorry, I'm missing the country's name. The capital is Belgrade, and invade countries without UN approval under various subterfuges, such as humanitarian intervention to protect the unprotected, so to speak, and extraterritorial killings by drone, as in the case of its own citizen in Afghanistan and in Yemen, and also the Iranian general Soleimani. Another example is that of the International Criminal Court. International Criminal Court, which was established by the Rome Statute, the Rome Treaty, US was a major player in drafting the treaty and ultimately did not sign the treaty, saying that US was concerned about its military personnel could be in jeopardy. Well, they have good reason for that, of course, given the track record of the US military personnel starting in Vietnam, and of course, we all know about Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. It also does not respect Geneva Convention, calling it a fight against terrorism, which started with this global war on terror, GWAT, with the Bush administration and famous Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, that these are enemy combatants. Anybody is an enemy combatant. And we just saw the latest example of going after the so-called enemy combatants in Afghanistan when the drone attack killed 13 civilians, including several children. Finally, I mean, there are many examples. I'm only throwing out some of the things that come to my mind, and they're major, is the economic sanction and blockades against countries like Iran, like Iraq previously, Venezuela, North Korea, of course, Cuba. The 60-year-old embargo still continues, and Syria. And then the final example is the US hypocrisy about the nuclear weapons. Now, in nuclear weapons, all the emphasis from United States is non-proliferation. It does not want other countries to acquire nuclear weapons. Yet, it's now embarking on a $30 trillion expansion of its own nuclear arsenal. So these things just continue as US being a law unto itself. And as I talk about this greater picture of US violating the rule of law, as much as they talk about, if you hear the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, he talks on every turn about the rule of law. And it is laughable because it is they who are violating the international rule of law at every time. And space law is no exception. So US operates on the premise, as far as space law is concerned, that there is no arms race in outer space. So no need for new laws. It doesn't agree with the notion that the current space law is inadequate, as we have heard from so eloquently from Professor Bhat and others, that it's inadequate not only in Article 4 in general. The OST was a fantastic treaty at the time of its creation, 1967, is no longer, given all the changes that we see in the space environment, and especially after the Cold War ended, and that it's inadequate to protect space from an arms race. And recall that the major space treaties, starting with the Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963, OST, 1967, the Moon Treaty, 1979, all of these were signed during early and middle of the Cold War superpower competition, when there were only two major spacefaring nations competing, as Professor Bhat has also mentioned. So for nearly 2 decades, there was nobody else until the European satellites, ESA, came on in the picture and started launching some satellites, also by the US at the time. And so since Sputnik, there wasn't much of a competition other than US and the Soviet Union. Now we have 80 countries that operate satellites, and although only a few can launch them. And majority of UN member states believe that space law needs to be updated to account for the new reality, except US, that is. US dismisses the notion of an impending arms race in outer space, I just mentioned. So they make an argument that the UN Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPIUS, which deals with the civilian aspects of the space programs, does not have the jurisdiction to talk about the problems of militarization of outer space. So you can shut off debate in COPIUS, where large numbers of General Assembly members participate, And okay, we're not going to talk about security aspects, because the security aspects, according to the US, should be taken up by the disarmament part of the United Nations, which is the Conference on Disarmament and the First Committee. And so, but what is US doing there? There, US is blocking all, even in consideration of the Paros Treaty draft that has been tabled by by Russia and and China for over 2 decades. So it can't go anywhere. So they have bottled up any discussion of, and they say, well, look, OST is good enough. We don't need, and we know the limitations of the OST. Now, Aruna also passingly mentioned about the anti-ballistic missile treaty, since my topic is really missile defense. And so let me just quickly come to the ABM treaty. And so 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty, also known as the ABM treaty, was a landmark treaty that was signed by Presidents Brezhnev and, of all people, the very conservative president of the United States, Richard Nixon. This was signed in 1972. And its principal aim was to ban anti-missile, otherwise known as missile defense. So anti-missile systems primarily for strategic missiles, meaning intercontinental ballistic missiles that have ranges of 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers or more, or miles or more. So this anti-missile treaty resulted in the arresting of the tremendous arms race that was going on, with thousands and thousands at the height of the Cold War. In those days, the US and Russia, Soviet Union, had over 60,000 nuclear warhead and hundreds and hundreds of ICBMs and other missiles that they were building at a very rapid rate. So it became clear that we have to arrest that. But the other thing is that it brought, by doing the arms control, it made arms control possible, and many arms control treaties followed since the ABM was signed, and it brought strategic stability. And but the other thing on the ABM treaty, its relation to space weapons is important, because the ABM treaty also prohibited, this is not much talked about at all, also prohibited space basing of weapons or even sensors. So you couldn't research, develop, test any space-based sensors. Imagine that. Is why the people who are such supporters of missile defense and space wanted to gut the ABM treaty. And I was in the Congress when these discussions were going on, and Russia at that time in 1990s, I was in Congress from 95 to 98. And it was just in the middle of the Clinton administration, and Boris Yeltsin was the president, and Russia was a very, very weak state of affairs. So the US was really running roughshod. And I was in part of many of these deliberations because of my committee jurisdiction on this. And so an ABM treaty, they were trying to gut it and try to modify it, gut it, and then eventually, as soon as Bush came, they gutted it, and it's gone. So it was a landmark treaty, but it prohibited weaponization of space as well. So it of course, as I said in the beginning, the US dismisses the notion of the impending arms race in outer space, and militarization has really got to weaponization now that particularly during the Trump administration, with the creation of the Space Force and all of this, and that they really wanted to go back to the days of the Star Wars, as Aruna mentioned about the Star Wars, and the CDs totally blocked the Conference on Disarmament, and so we are now in this situation. So I'll quickly now, I know that we want to leave just a little bit time for people's Q&A, so I won't take any more time. We're running short. So I will mention this, and again, I will make my slides available. Just recently, Dave and I were part of this international group of scientists and academics that was set up by my organization and another disarmament organization called Abolition 2000, which produced this report on ballistic missile defense and space weapons, opposing both of them. And we are saying that this is a real and current danger. I will quickly just name the people who are members of our international working group. We had Christian Allward, professor, not professor, researcher, Dr. Christian Allward, Germany, in the Hamburg University, myself, Professor Masako Ikegami, Tokyo Institute of Technology professor in Japan, Professor Klaus Montonen, a PhD from Finland, Professor Jürgen Schäffren from Germany, Dr. Dave Webb from the UK, and Monica Zappi, biologist, scientist from Italy. Other contributors were Professor Vladimir Kozin from Russia, Professor Rajaram Nagappa from the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, Professor Götz Neuneck, Hamburg University, and Professor Wei Zhang from Harvard University. So I was the coordinator and the editor of this report. And this report, we have recommended several steps, and for the civil society to take up and start organizing against. I mean, there's a lot of organizing that has gone on with the TPNW, but we really need to focus on missile defense and space weapons. And so we urgently warn against a dangerous situation developing regarding those two things. And we also strongly recommend that we ban all missile defense programs in Europe and cancel all the missile defense is still in a position where it can be tackled because it's still in relatively small programs, because as the programs grow, it's very difficult to, as Dave said, you want to take care of them when they are relatively small before many interests take shape. And we have several other recommendations about restoration of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which I didn't have a chance to talk about. But the Japanese decision to not go forward with the sea-based missile defense was a welcome decision, and we also urged Japan to sign the TPNW. And unfortunately, India's role in overall in the international disarmament affairs has become pathetic. I mean, because of its calculation of siding with the United States, it has really given up the position it once had in international affairs, especially of the UN, about peace, nuclear weapons, and so forth. So I'm disappointed, but our political situation is also in very difficult shape. Our meaning India, although I've been an American for a long time. But okay, with that, I will stop. And about the report, I will, in my slide, the website of information is there, and you can go, and we will be releasing the report officially on October 16th, Saturday, that is in Barcelona on a Zoom program with a side event. It's possible Professor Webb will be there in Barcelona. If he is, then he will be able to participate in live. And we have a small session to describe the report in detail and highlight the different chapters and authors, etc. With that, I thank you very much for the time and hope there are just a few minutes for some questions for other people.
Yes, of course, sir. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll definitely share the slides with every participant here. We'll briefly go over. I see that there have been a lot of discussion, and Professor Bruce has been very active in the chat box in terms of answering some questions. So any of the participants or anyone has any comments or questions that they would like to bring up to any of our presenters, kindly do so. And if you can, please also try to keep your video on so it is more engaging and this sort of a personal touch to it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Before actually the other participants can actually step in and ask the questions, I think there are a few questions which I saw in the chat box to which Professor Bruce has already answered, and even Dr. Aruna has also been responding quite frequently. Few of them, let me just take. I have just noted down a couple of them. I think probably there was a question with respect to passivation of the satellites. So does it help in any way for the purpose of preventing the debris creation? It's a very interesting the question. In fact, actually, a lot of plans were made for the purpose of actually taking out the left out energy in the satellite or maybe the rocket, so that it doesn't explode or it doesn't create actually the debris. But all these efforts have not been very successful. They have been of very limited success. And even in the recent past, 2018 and 2019, 3 of such satellites which have been passivated, they have exploded. 2018 and 2019, they have exploded. So therefore, that has always actually raised the fingers with respect to the success of the passivation. Then apart from that, one more important thing is that the passivation only helps in terms of taking the left out the fuel or energy, but it doesn't help in any way with respect to collision. The possibility of actually collision resulting in the cascade effect or the so spreading out of more and more debris, that is not being actually prevented by the process of passivation. So it is of very limited success, and only states like the United States are trying to do it in a very limited way. Then there was an interesting question about the 5G. I think I should say it's a kind of a debate between actually one of the participants and then Bruce. So Bruce was responding to actually the 5G. To my understanding, what is important for us to understand here is the sustainable development. Yes, we need 5G. There is no doubt in terms of that for the purpose of connectivity in different parts of the world. That may be one-sided argument, but at the same point of time, we're also concerned about actually say privacy, security, so on and so forth. So where does the sustainability lie? That's the moot question, and probably on the basis of that, we have to decide whether we have to go for 5G or whether actually there's a requirement of some kind of restriction. All those different kind of the questions that drop out of place. Finally, there was also another very basic question on international law. That's on the treaty enforcement. Treaty enforcement. Yes, I do agree that actually the international law has got some limitation in terms of enforcement. But we should not compare the international law with the domestic law. Because domestic law has got a very long history when compared to the international law, and it has got a strong enforcement system. Because see, people can be imprisoned or maybe actually they can be fined, some kind of a deterrence may be there. But whereas the treaty enforcement is concerned, it becomes extremely difficult when a developed country or a country having a greater bargaining power acts chaotically. In that circumstance, it becomes very difficult to actually bring them to book and ask them to comply with the treaty obligations. That has happened actually in many fields, not just in space law. For example, in law of the sea also, almost all the part of the world has become part of the UNCLOS, UN Convention on Law of the Sea. United States, we could not actually pressurize them to become party to the UNCLOS. So same kind of a situation we evidence in many other fields as well. And outer space law is not an exception. And in outer space, despite being the party to the 4 of the 5 space treaties, of course, United States is definitely not adhering to its obligations under the outer space treaty. Maybe, as rightly pointed out in the responses by the speaker, we have to actually make a collective effort. That's the only thing which is possible from our side. If, say, the United States says that, no, we are not going to recognize all these things, what should be the answer? That is an open-ended question. We don't have any answer for that.
I just want to add one thing to what you said, Sandeepa sir. And the best example is the Iraq war by US. That is the best example.
Of course, yeah, because despite the fact that there was no Security Council sanction, the United States has intervened in many places, not just in Iraq. Even Afghanistan also, it was a later sanction by the Security Council. Exactly. They proceeded first and then they went for a sanction in the Security Council.
And later the committee could not find even any mass destruction weapons as well.
Also, yes,
they had
absolutely
given as an excuse.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so if any other participant is having any question, please, you can feel free to actually ask those the questions.
I'll just make a comment about the U.S. Action in that it is such a self-defeating action, even though U.S. is, of course, the dominant world power. That it, despite the fact it is becoming perhaps more multilateral world with the China's rise and India and and more resurgence of Russia. At the same time, in the case of space, US also has the largest number of so-called space assets, satellites and other things. So if there is a problem in space that is some kind of a kinetic collision or something, who is going to be the biggest loser? The biggest loser is going to be the United States. So it is really in the UN interest. And I had chaired a panel, this is in 2004, on space security for the United States with the very well-known people, space experts and non-space experts. And it was quite clear that satellites in general are vulnerable. We know that. And it was realized from the very dawn of the space age why the Soviet Union and the United States had bilateral agreement not to touch each other's satellites. This was very much an agreement that stayed, because all we said at that time was that the satellites at that time, primarily in the 60s, were called the national technical means of each country, which is they were used to monitor the sites of each country's or the other countries, by each country, the other country's nuclear weapon sites. So it's very important, the activities in the silos of the ICBMs, et cetera, et cetera. So, but we also know how vulnerable satellites are. I mean, any country with a missile capability that can launch a missile of some range, North Korea, Iran, whatever, we can take down a lot of these satellites that are in LEO, in the low Earth orbit, very easily. And China has demonstrated, India has demonstrated. So it's really very, very puzzling why the US policymakers don't realize this situation and make it so bad that if you don't follow the law, then you cannot ask other people to do the same. And you'll be the suffering the most, because we are also the most dependent in the United States on satellite.
Thank you so much for that insight, sir. While we wait for a series of questions, I'd like to take some personal advantage from having this beautiful panel before me. So for a research project, I was actually asked to answer the question of whether the establishment of the United States Space Force is ipso facto an act of aggression or something that can be seen as the threat to use of force. And I would love to have any opinions on the matter, because I personally did not find any sort of legal way to argue the same, because of course there is no act directed towards a particular country, or there is no expression of the use of weaponry against another country, and it is merely political narrative. So if any of the panelists have any opinions, I would love to hear from you.
I abstain from commenting since I'm your teacher.
Yes, of course, sir.
Could you please repeat the question once again?
Yes, ma'am. So the question is whether the establishment of the United States Space Force is by in itself an act, can be seen as an act of aggression or a threat to use force against any other country. In that, is it unlawful in itself to establish a space force at the present time?
Okay, when the Outer Space Treaty is explicitly mentioning that it can be used only for peaceful purposes, how can US have a space force? Basing on what it can have that? How can it take such a decision to have? And because it is a powerful nation and there is no one to raise hand or to ask any question or explanation from this nation, it is doing everything according to its own whims and fancies. That has to be, this issue has to be raised by the international community. In fact, Bruce, do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah, at the time that the Space Force was created during Donald Trump's administration, the language that was used was that the United States, with this new Space Force, would dominate space. That was the language Trump used. And it's important to remember that at that moment, the Democrats, Trump is a Republican, right? The Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. They could have stopped Space Force in the House of Representatives. They controlled the House. They didn't. The only thing the Democrats asked was to change the name to Space Corps, like the Marine Corps. That was all. That was all they wanted. So that indicated to me that both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are lockstep in their desire to control and dominate space. Now, the point about the space debris and the Sabrata rays, doesn't the United States understand, that it's fouling its own nest? It's creating a problem for itself by all of this aggressive military activity? I think the answer is one of spiritual disconnection. The Native American, the indigenous people in this country, have long been saying that when the white man came to America, they noticed that he was blinded by his love for the green frog skin, the dollar bill. He couldn't see beyond his desire for money and power. He couldn't see his connection, his spiritual connection, his earthly connection to this planet. And I think that's ultimately a huge part of the answer. There is a deep spiritual disconnection in the minds and hearts of these militarists that run our country. And I have to go back also to that Operation Paperclip at the end of World War II, when the Nazis were brought to this country, 1,500 of them. Every part of the military industrial complex, they were placed in each various department. And so you have to ask the question, was there an ideological contamination when they came to America? Did the Nazi ethic, Deutschland über alles, Germany overall, what is the difference between that and the US's slogan, Master of Space?
I'll just add one more thing to that on this issue of the congressional politics, having been there on the Armed Services Committee and so forth. Yes, I mean, this business of Space Force, as your research question pointed out, probably our answer, that it was, of course, more at this time, more of a politics to establish a foothold that in future we can expand programs under this rubric, creating a new service, which means new bureaucracy, more money, so et cetera, because this is also a bureaucratic fight. But on the other hand, the Donald Trump administration saw the resurgence of the Star Wars program, because he was, of course, not very knowledgeable about these things, and he was just letting these people like John Bolton and Elliot Abrams and all these people take over the administration and run their thing. So they created quickly the Space Force because they wanted to have also a space-based experiment. Michael Griffin, who was the director of technology in the SDIO, Strategic Defense Initiative Program, which is the Star Wars, back in the 80s, also became the Undersecretary of Defense for testing and logistics under the Trump administration. 30 years later, he came back to the Pentagon to head up this division. And he said by 2023, we will have a space-based experiment. So they were so eager to change facts in the space, like changing facts on the ground, to get a foothold. So make a Space Force, make a space-based experiment, and all these a very right-wing ideology-driven decisions. That's why these things happen, and it doesn't have a lot of support in throughout the armed services, but they were running almost as a rogue kind of an entity within the system.
Could I just add something quickly?
Yes.
Because the problem, I think, is that once one nation has done this, especially a dominant nation like the United States, that is, create a space force and claim to be wishing to dominate that, and also to point out that it's the next war-fighting domain, I think, as Aruna has said, this goes totally against the Outer Space Treaty, but other nations are following. The UK, for example, launches its own space force, although it's called Space Command. And when that was launched, there was a statement made by the Secretary of Defense to say, today we show the sky is no longer the limit for our armed forces. So that kind of language and those kind of comments are being followed on by other nations, and others are picking this up too. So it kind of escalating, and what we really need to do is for more nations to speak out against this very loudly, to say that this is not the way for the human race to progress. We must have more peaceful and cooperative ventures, not competitive and war fighting ones.
Thank you so much for those insights. I'll yield the floor to any other questions that we have. And yes, of course, ma'am. I'll yield the floor to any for any other questions that we have. And if not, we'll move on to the vote of thanks. Right. All right. So I believe we can now yield the floor for the vote of thanks. Shouvik sir, I invite you to please give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. I would like to begin the vote of thanks, first of all, by thanking all the participants who have patiently chosen to be here with us over these 2 hours, over this insightful discussion, and definitely our resource persons, Professor Gagnon, Professor Webb, Professor Camila, and Professor Ghoshroy, and especially, I believe, Professor Ghoshroy, Professor Gagnon, this is, they had to be quite a bit of an early riser in order to participate in this. I would also personally like to comment upon the fact that this is one of the very few online and workshops that I have seen wherein the resource persons have chosen to interact with the participants so much in such a positive fashion in the chat box, answering patiently to all the questions. And I would also like to thank, of course, Professor Sandeepa Bhat, without whose inspiration and leadership this entire program and the entire center would not have been here. And last but not the least, I would like to end with thanking all the student members of the Center for Aviation and Space Laws, for Rohit Gupta, who has done a very good job in conducting this entire program, and all of the other members who have played their valuable roles, like Mr. Tushar Krishna, Mr. Shel Luharia, Abha Shakar, Soumya Gupta, and Anisha Mishra. And of course, we would like to thank everybody else who have been, as I said, patiently with us and made this entire thing a very successful one. I really look forward to further engagement with all of you with similar programs in the days to come. So on behalf of CASL and NUJS, we would like to thank you all, and thereby conclude this program. Thank you.